to today's discussion on how the war in Ukraine will impact China's engagement in Eastern Europe. My name is James Gethin-Evans. I'm the convener along with Dr. Nargis Casanova of today's lecture, which is part of a series on China's Belt Road Initiative sponsored by the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here at Harvard University. We're speaking to you today during a somber time for Europe. So today's event is mindful of the violence and destruction of Russia's invasion against Ukraine. But today we will focus on the potential longer-term impacts of the war. China has developed extensive political and economic ties with Eastern Europe over the past few decades, not to mention that the region is incredibly important as a land bridge between China and Europe for China's Belt Road Initiative. The closing of borders and the hardening of divisions between Russia and the West will undoubtedly pose challenges to China's global geopolitical ambitions. Today's panelists will present their views on how the dramatic developments in Ukraine will alter China's presence in Eastern Europe. We are joined today by four fantastic panelists. First, Jinghan Zheng is Professor of China and International Studies at Lancaster University in the UK, where he researches Chinese politics and international relations. He's most recently the author of Artificial Intelligence with Chinese Characteristics, National Strategy, Security and Authoritarian Governance, which I believe you currently have in your hand. Yes, it's just arrived, as well as other books on Chinese foreign policy, ideology in Chinese politics, and China-EU relations. Jeremy Garlick is director of the Masaryk Center for International Studies and associate professor of international relations and China studies at Prague University of Economics and Business. His research focuses on the Belt Road Initiative, China's relations with Central and Eastern Europe, China-Middle East relations, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Most recently, he is the author of Advantage China, Agent of Change in an Era of Global Disruption, which is forthcoming next year. So maybe next year when we have you back, then you can show us the book. Una Alexandra Borzina-Chernakova is head of China Studies at Riga Stradins University and head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. She regularly publishes on PRC political discourse, contemporary Chinese ideology, EU-China relations, as well as the Belt Road Initiative and other transcontinental interconnectivity initiatives. And I'm pleased to say that she's also the author of a new book called Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia, which I believe is now in your possession. Congratulations again. Our final speaker is Arseny Savitsky, who's the co-founder and director of the Minsk-based Center for Strategic and Foreign Policy Studies. He's also an expert on Belarusian security and foreign policy, and he focuses on international and regional security, strategic affairs, and Russia and Eurasia. He is currently completing his doctoral research at the Belarusian National Academy of Science, where he also works as a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Globalization, Integration, and Sociocultural Cooperation. So to start off our discussion, I would like to invite Professor Zheng to talk about how he thinks the war will impact the interests of China's domestic actors in Eastern Europe.
Thanks, James, and thanks for having me at this event. I think I'd like to mainly focusing on why China is actually having its current position on this war and the domestic debate within China about this war. And as we all know that according to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, China's official position is that China advocates respecting and safeguarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. At the same time, China thinks that Russia's legitimate security demands should be taken seriously and properly addressed. And this middle point, Chinese position, has often been interpreted by many as a strategic ambiguity, in which Chinese leadership are looking for long-term direct and indirect opportunity from this crisis in order to maximize Chinese national interests. But what I have seen here is probably what I would call non-strategic ambiguity or probably passive ambiguity. What I have seen here really at the strategic level, there is lack of consensus within the Chinese leadership about this war. And I think Chinese understanding of this war and its potential consequences and implication for Europe, Russia, China, and the world are yet to be developed. And this is very unique, not unique in China. I think probably for all countries, we all need to have a little bit more understanding of where this is going and its potential implication. And we shouldn't forget that within China, the Chinese leadership are very much occupied with much more important and pressing domestic issues, such as the new national-wide wave of COVID in Shanghai, recently in Beijing, and then the forthcoming 20th Party Congress, which is occupy a lot of attention of the Chinese leadership. At the same time, at the sub-national level, what I have seen here is many Chinese companies and sub-national actors are actually affected by this war. They are much more economically motivated rather than geopolitically motivated. And usually we analyze them or understand them under the umbrella of Chinese overseas national interests. But the key point here is those actors have very different agenda and very different interests, and would like to see very different Chinese position on these wars. So collectively, what I'm seeing here is an ongoing debate within Chinese domestic leadership, and different actors are trying to influence about Chinese position on this war, and this leads to a more relatively passive Chinese position. And why China is having this position at the moment, or what are the debate? And we all know that indeed China had considerable investment and trade in Ukraine, and China is Ukraine's largest trading partner. And if you go deeper to examine this bilateral relation between Ukraine and China, and if you compare China and Russia relation as a strategic alliance without limits, I would call China and Ukraine relation is some sort of semi-strategic partnership. And because Ukraine is so important to China, geographically speaking, it lies in a very important place, which is key to China's transport to Europe by both land and air. And not surprisingly, Ukraine is China's key BRI, Belt and Road Initiative partner and country in Europe. And Ukraine-China trade goes beyond agriculture. Sometimes they have some even military collaboration. China is one of the biggest overseas buyer of Ukraine weapons. And think about where China got its first aircraft carrier from Ukraine. So it is a foreign policy challenge for China. And what we have seen here is China is being forced to choose between a strategic ally, which is Russia, and a semi-strategic partner, Ukraine. And as you can imagine, this is going to be a very difficult choice. This is why I do not think what China is doing now is a strategic ambiguity. I think it's ambiguous, but not very strategic. It's simply lack of options and lack of consensus, and different Chinese actors have different agenda on this matter. And within China, you can already see that in social media, for example, the opinion is also divided as well. Many are buying into the Russian narrative of how this war is triggered by NATO and the United States. But this is not a new Chinese perception or influenced by Russia. China has always had this narrative of how NATO expansion is based on a Cold War mentality. So this is not new development. But at the same time, there are a few, mostly a liberal Chinese influencer, are talking about the impact of this war on liberal international order. They are taking the moral high ground of accusing Russia's wrongdoing and Chinese foreign policy on protecting national sovereignty, which we have just talked about. And some of them are even laughing at Russia's incapacity to make any progress in this war. So the public opinion is divided. And within the political system, the debate is very hot as well. On the one side, you got some people argue that Russia is China's one of very few allies, and what Russia is doing, they helping Beijing to distract Washington from its pressure on China. So China shouldn't be really helping the US to do any sanction, because what the US is asking is, can China help me to fight Russia, your friends Russia, so we can concentrate on fighting you later? To many people within the Chinese strategic analysts, it does not make sense. However, on the other side, many are warning the consequences of getting too close with Russia, or at least appear to get close with Russia. They were saying that China will be dragged by Russia into this anti-Western agenda is going to have severe consequences for China's economic development, for China's relation with the West. And take EU-China relation as an example. China's export to EU and UK is almost 10 times more than it's to Russia. So economically speaking, Russia is not really worthy for China to give up the Europe, and let alone there will be consequences of Western sanction on China, Chinese companies. So a lot of Chinese transnational state-owned enterprise, Chinese companies are not very comfortable with the idea of China getting too close with Moscow, because it's going to affect their operation overseas and create a lot of problems for them. And you can see that both sides have a point, and there's no better way to, a better solution than keep this ambiguous position. At the same time, domestic issue coming, occupying the leadership's attention, especially about the COVID. So this is why I think what China is doing now is non-strategic ambiguous position, or probably some passive Chinese position. I'm going to stop here, and I understand my other panelists will focus on and will talk about how this war has been affecting China's engagement in Europe.
Thank you very much, Jinhan. Well, I was wondering, what's the so Ukraine, along with Eastern Europe, was seen as a bridge, right, between Eurasia and Europe, and China was trying to connect sort of this mega continent. And now, either way, the divisions will be, divisions are rising, right? Is it, you think, the end of this kind of big aspiration of China to connect this mega continent, or not? Is it what's the take? I understand there is a lot of discussions and ambiguity, but in a nutshell.
Right. I think probably the takeaway here is there's no consensus in China of what kind of better position China can keep, or what China should be doing, and China still yet to understand the consequences. And obviously, if you really talk about the connectivity, the war has been seriously affecting China's connectivity. And some people are saying that now, imagining in the future, if Russia is now being sanctioned, and if China want to have transport to go to Europe through Russia territory, how is that possible, or how this is not going to be affected? And the war per se in Ukraine has been seriously affecting Chinese investment and Chinese infrastructure projects there, things like that. So I think the takeaway here is really Chinese strategic analysts are developing more understanding of this war, and there is no clear understanding or consensus on its potential implication.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, can we go to you? What's your take on the situation? How does the war impact China's engagement in Eastern Europe, BRI, connectivity, all these things?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to maybe take I don't think it's a controversial position. It's certainly not controversial here in the Czech Republic, but I'm going to say from the start that the Ukraine war is the nail in the coffin of China-CEE cooperation. And I'm going to focus on China's CEE cooperation, China's Central Eastern and Eastern Europe cooperation, which, just to explain, in case there's people that are not so aware of this, I think people in Europe are aware of it, but maybe people in North America not so aware of it. I'm going to talk about the 16+1, which later became the 17+1, because this was a kind of turning point, or supposed to be a turning point in China's CEE relations. So in 2011 to 2012, China and Poland got together and launched this so-called 16+1 cooperation between China and CEE countries. So there were 16 CEE countries included. 11 of them were EU members. 5 of them were not EU members, right? And later on, Greece was added to make it 17+1. So I think this was kind of the warming up of China-CEE relations, and we were all hopeful that it was going to go well. But I'm going to explain now why I think it's failed. And I have to go back a little bit into the history. I'm not going to talk too long about the history, just a little bit back into that, because I think there are 4 reasons why China-CEE cooperation was already failing, and why this is just the nail in the coffin. This is kind of the end of it, and it's going to need a complete reset, right? And I mean, I think that from the Chinese side, they're going to need to understand that it needs a complete reset. I mean, I was visited last week by a scholar from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and I basically spent an hour and a half explaining to him why it's not going well, right? And there seems to be this impression in China up to now that's been going really well, and it's all going fantastically. And I can tell you from the Czech perspective, or from the CE perspective, this is a completely different story, that it's not going well. So I'm going to give you 4 reasons why it was already failing, right? So the first one is from the history, going back into the history of it, the Cold War history. China's often been recently, in the last 10 years, talking about traditional friendship with Central and Eastern Europe. But if you go back to the Cold War, there really wasn't, although these states were all communist states, there really wasn't a close connection between China because of the Soviet influence and the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s and 1960s. There was never a close relationship during the Cold War. They're all communist states, and when I was growing up, we all thought, communist states, they're all on the same side, but there really was no close relationship. And then when the Cold War ended in the 1990s, obviously all the newly, democratic countries of Central and Eastern Europe wanted to, shift more to the West, right? They wanted to join the EU, they wanted to join NATO. For example, Czech Republic, where I am now, hurried to join NATO and the EU, and that was true of many of the countries. And so 1990s and into the 2000s, there was no focus on China. There's almost, if you look at the literature, there's almost no literature even on China-CE cooperation because there wasn't any, right? So many of these countries became EU members. And then the 16+1 came along, right? 2011, 2012, it was launched. This new mechanism for cooperation between China, Central and Eastern European countries. So I want to say that the history of it is there was not close cooperation, and then suddenly there was no roots for it, right? There was no tradition, there was no foundation for it. So it was weak, from the beginning. That's my first point. Second point is that the platform, the 16+1 platform, although, I've talked to Chinese scholars and they say, well, it was launched with Poland and this kind of thing, but actually it's a typical Chinese cooperation platform with the N+1 formula. It resembles the, China Arab States Cooperation Forum or the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, or one of those. It's a very similar kind of platform to those. And what I want to say is that one of the reasons why, the second reason here why it doesn't work is because it's an attempt to launch a cooperation with Chinese characteristics rather than coming out of the 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe themselves. It does not emerge from the local situation, right? So from the Chinese side, I think they've got wrong is that they haven't understood that this is not a block of countries. You can't really expect these countries to be integrated as a block, and they've tried to impose a Chinese platform on the countries. So for example, Czech Republic and Hungary, neighbors, but they really are not closely connected. Hungarian is a completely different language to Czech. They're mutually incomprehensible. They have different traditions and culture. It's really not an integrated region. So the Chinese attempt to, introduce Chinese norms and practices into this region has not taken enough account of the local setting, and it's not taken root for that reason. So that's kind of my second point I want to make. The third point, and getting more serious, is after about, so the early years, 2012 up to about 2016 or 2017, it seemed to be going pretty well. There was a lot of there were annual meetings, and there seemed to be a lot of cooperation at the leadership level. But where it's broken down here is the investment that China promised to Central and Eastern Europe. There was talk of a $10 billion credit line, a lot of investments here in the Czech Republic. And the investment program has been extremely underwhelming. There's been far more investment capital going into Western Europe. The amount of capital going into Central and Eastern Europe has really been insignificant. There's not been a lot of activity. For example, in the Czech Republic, Chinese company CEFC bought a football club and a brewery and a media company, but there wasn't any greenfield investment, no new jobs created. So people here were very disappointed with the promised investment. So I think this is another reason why it was already failing by about 2017, 2018. And then the fourth point I want to make is the generally poor image of China, which has just been declining, right? I mean, poor image of China caused, and this is a very important issue to people here in Central and Eastern Europe. It's very important to Czechs. We see also it's important to Lithuanians. Lithuania withdrew from the 17+1 last year. Very important to a lot of people here. the image of China, the Xinjiang question, the Hong Kong question, Tibet, Taiwan, all of these kind of questions have caused a major decline in China's image, or it was not so strong in the first place, and it's been declining. And then we had COVID coming along, which has just damaged the image further. So all of these things, you know, people here, I would say, generally have created a very poor image of China, which has not helped to foster this cooperation. Last year, 2021, we had the 17+1 summit, which was for the first time led by Xi Jinping, and several Central and Eastern European countries decided not to send their leaders to that summit. It was an online virtual summit, but several countries decided not to send their leaders, which was a real, you know, snub, I think, to Xi Jinping, a real indication of how the platform is failing. And we've seen Lithuania, you know, withdraw from the platform. So just coming to the Ukraine war, I think what's happened now is that people had already formed a poor impression of China's cooperation with China, seeing it as an attempt to divide Europe, to create a new bloc in Central and Eastern Europe, dividing the EU. A lot of negative impressions of China. And the Ukraine war is now just exacerbating this because, you know, there is almost universal condemnation of Russia here, right? In Central and Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, there's a strong affinity with Ukraine. There was just a strong feeling that Ukrainians, you know, could be us. They remember the Russian tanks rolling into Prague in 1968. There's a very strong historical memory of this. There's a very strong identification with Ukraine, very strong condemnation of Russia. And China, by not condemning Russia and by appearing to, you know, I've listened to what Jinghan said about non-committal, but by appearing to side with Russia and by publishing editorials in Global Times, which are anti-NATO, anti-US, this is destroying the last pieces of China's image in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's just, I don't think there's any way back without a complete reset. I think it's a very poor outcome now for China-CEE cooperation. So I'll just stop there and we can go on.
Thank you very much. Well, it seems you're very critical of the 17 plus one mechanism, but it seems that in these multilateral platforms work better in other regions, like the FOCAC, for example, the China-Africa Forum. It doesn't have the same problems going well in Central Asia as well. SCO and, you know, also 5+1 mechanism is also working quite nicely. Can it be actually the case that in Central Eastern Europe it doesn't work because there are other blocks? There is the European Union, there is NATO, of course, so which creates these tensions. So it's sort of a special region because it is Europe.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. You know, it is a special region, but as I was trying to point out, it's not really a region. You know, I mean, it's not a region in that it's not a unified region, Central and Eastern Europe. I think China's tried to impose this region, sense of it being a region. I mean, of course, we talk about Central and Eastern Europe, but there's you know, while I'm talking, you know, you've got in the title of this Eastern Europe, and I'm talking about Central and Eastern Europe. You know, for example, Czech people, they don't see themselves as Eastern Europeans. They see themselves as Central Europeans, right? They identify more with Austria. They want to be part of the West. They don't identify themselves with Eastern Europe. It's in fact, it's quite offensive to Czech people. They keep you know, when I first came here, I was reminded many times, we are not Eastern Europe, we are Central Europe, you know? So it's not a very integrated region. I mean, I think it's a region where you have various sub-regions, Central Europe, Baltic states, Balkan states, you know? There's various sub-regions within it, and it's not a unified region. So I think for this reason, I think, in my opinion, the Chinese have really not understood the region well. And as you say, there's the question of the EU as well. It's the question of EU integration, which, you know, the 16+1 appears to be at cross purposes with that.
well, there is a lot of misunderstanding of regions, of countries, clearly, right? So that's why we're in the situation we're in today. Oh, Una, can we go to you? What's your take? Did it work ever? And what's happening now, and what can happen?
Yes, thank you, Nargis. And I just want to add that, yes, indeed, China has a very creative approach toward what is a region, what isn't a region. It's kind of a region shaping. I think we see that also in Central Asia, whether you add Afghanistan or not, these kinds of things. And I think 16+1 was also a very interesting example of region shaping, basically, because before that, none of us actually thought that we had much in common in terms of history, language, political system with, for example, Albania. But now I have Albanian colleagues that I work with. And so, yeah. But actually, I wish I had other points to, another lens, another prism to add to Jeremy's excellent points. But actually, I'm just going to repeat a lot of what he said, but in other words, but zooming in on the Baltic region. So Ukraine, so immediately to answer the question that is being posed in the seminar, Ukraine is not decisive. It is just one big piece of the puzzle. So let us get there step by step. So indeed, the loss of interest in 16+1 and Belt and Road later, I'm going to touch on Belt and Road as well. There was this nail in the coffin view that Jeremy outlined, right? So it's one by one. And the first issue, of course, was the fact that there were no deliverables. And I think that maybe some colleagues favor the value argument, others favor the political argument. Then there are other colleagues who favor the Washington argument, the security argument. I believe that everybody was ready to shut their eyes here when they were being addressed as Eastern Europe, even though, as Jeremy well knows, the same thing that he pointed out with Czech, stressing we're Central Europe, same thing as with us, but we also say we always say we're Northern Europe, right? But for that moment, out of pragmatic reasons, everybody was ready to let that slide. So I think that the fact that the format, despite huge political will, has not delivered is the biggest nail in its coffin. Now, what led to this? And I take Jeremy's point that he calls it cooperation with Chinese characteristics. But basically, it is also the fact that South-South logic, the formats that you, Nargis, also described, South-South logic was imposed on 16+1. But what the Baltic expected was China, what the Western Europe had. Hearing of these stories, how everybody had gotten rich off of trading with China, how our transportation sector can get revitalized by servicing Chinese goods flowing towards Western Europe. Secondly, how our exports will be welcomed to China, because why not? Because you have Danone yogurt as this primary advertising stunt that has been imposed on the Chinese, right? So why not our yogurt? So that's the second. And the third, of course, FDI, something Jeremy also touched upon. Now the high-tech investment is going to come. Our excellent workforce that is not really expensive due to our economy is going to be put to use, but very, very highly educated, right? But none of that really worked out, because what China imposed was the South-South logic instead. Why don't we give you loans and you build roads, in a nutshell? And that's not what we wanted. In another aspect, I apologize for my voice. I've caught the flu. It's almost ironic how we've been all looking out for COVID and we end up with flu. So yeah, just a side note. And this model that the Baltics wanted to pursue with China, be it in 16+1 or Belt and Road, did not entail any shifts in loyalties. That is why the socialist friendship argument indeed was twice as true for the Baltics. When China came up with that first, everybody was shocked. But at the same time, China later adapted it, especially during the BRI phase, starting from 2016. China became sensitive to the issue and they started shaping their narrative, at least here, around 3 or even 4 regions of Central and Eastern Europe, as they called it. The Baltic states are special, the Visegrad region is special, then you have the Balkan states that are EU member states, and then you have the candidate states in the Balkans. So that China kind of got the hint, right? And still nothing. But the values aspect wasn't there because it was never a strategic choice for the Baltics. It was not, we were not looking for adding more pillars to our foreign policy, because our foreign policy basically has the one pillar, the security pillar, the US, and the engulfing family, everything else pillar. God help us that it doesn't become the security pillar as well, the EU, right? So there was no, that we weren't looking for any more pillars, whereas China was kind of hoping that we would. And all of that is true. Plus, for Belt and Road, there's another factor that Arseniy is going to be talking about. I think that's the Belarus factor, because all of the promise of Chinese involvement in the Baltic region hinged upon one specific project, hinged upon the Great Stone by Minsk. And after the 2028 August elections and the demonstrations, the Baltic states took a very harsh stance vis-a-vis Lukashenko. So no cooperation was coming through Belarus. And even before that, de facto, there was nothing, not very much to speak on behalf of it. Now, let's move to our era. I have colleagues who have pointed out in their publications that COVID was a factor across all of Europe, right? That it really damaged China's reputation, China's soft power, you whatever way you decide to call it, including Central and Eastern Europe. But I have to say that here, the Latvian case has actually been an outlier. We did research as part of a bigger consortium, and we discovered that probably because the Chinese involvement, the official Chinese involvement in the country had been so low key, no loud statements, no wolf warriors, very much like just culture-oriented Xinhua reposts, there was no major outlash towards China. So in fact, the Latvian public opinion was the highest one of China during COVID, was the highest one among all EU member states that were surveyed. But of course, that changed. And that's what I want to say, that Ukraine matters, because basically what it does, more of the same. It brings out the Chinese position on not wanting to condemn Russia. So that's a naturally sensitive topic in the Baltics. So the answer to the name of today's seminar is negatively, but how far? And I think China has become very apprehensive of this, and the delegation that Jeremy also pointed out, he had a visit from, that's also been reported in the Global Times, and the name is very telling, and it says veteran Chinese envoy head CEC visit to clarify misunderstanding over Ukraine. So it means that China is perceptive towards what Ukraine has done for China and Central and Eastern Europe, including China and the Baltics. Of course, Lithuania is not on the list. We can all guess why. Lithuania is not included in this program, but still, Latvia is. But again, there's little room for the rekindling in the current format, because these issues go, like I said, beyond Ukraine, and because, going back to my initial argument, even when the weather was fair, the relationship was great, there was a lot of optimism, nothing really happened. So no deliverables, hence no interdependence. We just published yesterday with the European think tank Network on China, a report which is based on country level analysis, which looks at the interdependencies our countries have with China. And of course, the Latvian chapter is none, practically. That's where I'm going to stop. But I want to make one observation, because I think I've been using the word 16+1 in Belt and Road quite freely. I've been dropping them without the conceptual framing that this format would require, probably. In fact, and that has been on purpose, because starting from 2016, the Chinese official messaging in the Baltics has been replacing 16+1 with Belt and Road, adding 16+1 as one of the aspects of the Belt and Road cooperation, kind of going under and saying, you are this has been the initial launch pad of Belt and Road. And this is also where China used the argument saying that this is not a South-South approach, because we have Western partners on board of Belt and Road, meaning Italy and Greece, I guess. So that's that's how these two concepts became muddied in the discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Una. And double appreciation for doing it, you know, in your condition. Arseny, let's go to you. It seems there were deliverables for Belarus. Una mentioned the Great Stone Industrial Park. There were loans. There were all kinds of agreements, and then the railway connection, of course, goes through Belarus. How does it look from Minsk?
Yeah, thank you, Nargis, for the invitation. Sorry, I also have catched a cold, so I would like to start from the point that actually we need to discuss at least three crises that affected China's engagement with Belarus and broader in the Eastern European region. The first crisis actually started in 2014 when Russia decided to commit aggression against Ukraine, annexing Crimea, as well as destabilizing Donbass. And these steps already affected China's plans to promote the Belt and Road Initiative in the Eastern Europe. Initially, Ukraine had been considered as a key element within the Belt and Road Initiative in the Eastern Europe. China was planning to invest at least 10-15 billion dollars in the infrastructure projects in Crimea, especially building an industrial park as well as a deep sea port. But the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by the Russian Federation actually spoiled these plans. But that is how 1 year after, the head of China, Xi Jinping, appeared in Belarus. In May 2015, he paid a state visit to our country and proclaimed that Belarus would become the key element within the Belt and Road Initiative in the Eastern Europe. Thus, actually, Belarus substituted Ukraine in the Chinese strategic planning with regards to this initiative, due to the high level of political military risks associated with Russia-Ukraine confrontation. While Belarus that time already managed to distance from this war, to keep a neutral position, but also a very important moment, our country started normalization process with the EU and the United States. The Western countries began lifting sanctions, and this also facilitated cooperation with China. And by the way, the Great Stone Industrial Park that actually dates back in 2010 and was frozen also due to the Western sanctions against Belarus between 2011 and 2014, was reactivated immediately after the Xi Jinping's visit in Belarus in 2015. The deal between Minsk and Beijing was the following. President Lukashenko promised China to do all the best in order to provide Chinese companies investing in Belarus with access to the European market. While China was interested in investing in Belarus and to facilitate closer relations between Belarus and the European Union. And starting from the 2015, group of Chinese experts started to produce recommendations for the Belarusian government how to reform the Belarusian economy and diversify its foreign economic ties. And according to these recommendations, Belarus was supposed to access the WTO and to sign a special economic agreement with the European Union by 2020. Also, the Belarusian authorities provided the industrial park with a special tax preferential regime. Everything stopped with the second crisis. Una has mentioned already it. I mean, the domestic political crisis in Belarus after the August 2020 presidential elections that triggered unprecedented wave of sanctions against Belarus from the West, including the sectoral economic sanctions. And I believe that at this point, China became quite disappointed with its Belarusian counterpart. And when the Belarusian leadership started to escalate the tensions in relations with the West, it seemed that China had to reconsider another options. And my feeling is that China returned back to the initial plans to work with Ukraine. Since the political military situation that time became more or less stable comparing to the 2014-2015 period. Also, the association agreement and free trade agreement between Ukraine and the European Union became into force since 2017. Immediately, the negotiations about the free trade zone between Ukraine and China were reactivated. In June 2021, Chinese and Ukrainian governments signed an infrastructure and joint project agreements. By the way, a roadmap of these joint projects was designed by Chinese experts already in 2014-2015. And it amounted about 60 infrastructure projects with, I guess, $15–20 billion investments. So the political crisis in Belarus actually led China to reconsider the future prospects of the Belt and Road Initiative in the region. The Western sanctions against Belarus transformed our country in a quite toxic partner for China. And as I have said, it seems that Chinese leadership was quite disappointed by the behavior of the Belarusian leadership. And the fact that Alexander Lukashenko was not invited to the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing manifests this. And finally, the third crisis, actually the continuation or the escalation of war between Ukraine and Russia, and unfortunately the engagement of Belarus in this war on the Russia side has made Belarus completely irrelevant partner for promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, China has joined some Western sanction regimes against Belarus because the official explanation that they are afraid of secondary sanctions against Chinese companies. But frankly speaking, it's a speculation because none of the sanctioned regimes envisage secondary sanctions yet. But nevertheless, it seems that China is hedging the risks. And for instance, Chinese companies have already excluded Belarus from their transit logistic corridor, China-Europe. Car producer Geely stopped production in Belarus, as well as the Huawei is rejecting to supply Belarus with 5G equipment. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank stopped financing all projects in Belarus. So it also a demonstration that I think China is quite irritated by the behavior of our country, especially in the context of this security crisis. Both actions of Russia and Belarus undermine China's plans to promote the Belt and Road Initiative in the region. And if I may, I could also speak about some midterm and long-term implications, how I can see it from Belarus. First of all, I can describe China's position as a strategic patience. I would like to recall the model of behavior of China in 2014, when Russia spoiled its plans in Ukraine. It took 1 year for Beijing to decide how to act in this new environment. And only after that, Xi Jinping arrived in Belarus. So it took only 1 year. Then I expect that the current environment, China will be paying more attention to the so-called Southern Corridor that is going through the Central Asian states, Caspian Sea, Caucasus. Plus, I expect that China will intensify its relations with Turkey, and probably Turkey may become a new bridge connecting China and Europe in this new geopolitical environment. These strategic implications of the Russia-Ukraine war, I believe, will be a new round of post-Soviet space disintegration. And frankly speaking, I expect that China will definitely try to benefit from this disintegration, increasing its influence both in the Central Asian region, but also in the Eastern Europe, where China is trying to secure its position already now in the post-conflict environment. As far as I know, Kiev and Beijing are holding a sort of consultations because Ukraine is considering China as one of the security donors in future. And the deal is about how China could contribute to the reconstruction and restoration of Ukraine after the war. And it is also one of the elements of this strategic patience strategy from which China could benefit. Since the disintegration of the post-Soviet space will be accompanied by increasing competition between China and Russia. I think the relations between two countries will be less politically polite, I would say. Thank you.
Very much. I'm with you on the disintegration of the post-Soviet space. James, can I pass the baton to you?
Yeah, we've had. Thank you all for your excellent points. We've had some questions coming in from the audience, and for those of you on the call, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. The first question is for Dr. Zeng, which is sort of invoking George Medelsky's idea of the long cycle theory. But the sort of heart of the question is whether or not China sees what's happening in Ukraine as an opportunity to sort of assert itself as a new global leader. You know, that is, as Arseny was just saying, that if China and Russia tensions are sort of going to become more frictious, and if Russia's position in the world order is going to decline, does this open up a new space that the Chinese leadership can sort of see for Chinese leadership in a sort of new post-Ukraine era? And then there are sort of two semi-related questions. One plays on what Arseny was just saying to do with the pivot away from the Eurasian land bridge and to the viability of other options. That is through Turkey, we'll maybe see sort of like a renewed focus on the sea routes that have sort of traditionally played one half of the Belt Road Initiative. Are there really viable routes that sort of don't have to pass through Russia that China might rely on? And then the flip side of that question is, if we're going to see a reduction in trade between, you know, the sort of the West and China through Russia and these blocks, is that going to risk economic disruption, high inflation? We've seen that as a sort of key issue in the French election that just happened, that sort of fuels some of the Front National, the far right discourse in France. Is that going to become more of a risk within Western Europe? And so to start with, let's go to Dr. Zeng about the prospects for China's leadership.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think it's yet to understand about what precisely might be the implication of it. Obviously, some people are saying that this offers what the crisis might potentially offers windows of opportunity for China. And the most importantly for China is that the US is giving considerable pressure on China strategically, and what Russia is doing has been distracting Washington from doing what it's doing, and then taking a lot of a burden of this strategic pressure from China. So from that point of view, some Chinese strategic analysts did say that, well, this might offer a new opportunity for China to play. But what I have seen here and hearing from what other panelists have been saying is indeed the opposite kind of answer. And seems to me that the world has very high, or probably I shouldn't say the world, Europe have very high expectation of the world, what China can do and what China should do. But what China chooses to do now at the moment is being restricted by a lot of factors, as mentioned, domestic consensus, a lot of things, and also its own capacity. Right? I think other panelists talk about how China do not understand the other region. And that's a common kind of convention. That's what China understands very well. So in China, we see in the Chinese university think tank, China has been frequently saying that in order to better develop Belt and Road Initiative, we need to have regional expertise. We need to have people who understand the region, and we don't have that. I often meet some Chinese scholars who work on Latin America, and the reason they work on now Latin America because the government asked them to do that. They were previously working on Russia or on other matters, and then you assign them to working on Latin America strategically, so they now work on Latin America. They have never been to Latin America, only been there once, and do not speak the local language. And that's the situation China is facing. We have to bear in mind the rise of China is a recent phenomenon. China is learning how to become a global leader. China is yet to develop its understanding about the region, about the Middle East, about Russia, about Middle East, about Europe. So it's very understandable why China do not have very sophisticated understanding of those matters. And now suddenly the world or the Europe is or the US asking China to make a stance on this matter. And I don't think China clearly understands the situation. They do not have the expertise. And yet what China can offer to solve the situation. I think there's very limited what China can do. So China choose a natural position as many developing countries did, like India, Brazil, South Africa. None of them really be coming out looking at their record of in the UN and other places. They do not come out to condemn Russia as the West did. So the position China, I do see there is a gap between developed country and developing country on this matter. And China is simply choosing an old way, which is a developing country way. This is something that we don't really understand or do want to get too much involved. We want to keep independently or non-alliance kind of approach just to do that. It's okay for other countries to do it, like India, Brazil. But now it seems not so okay for China to do it because the world is, or Europe is expecting China to be a global leader. But what China chooses to do is we don't want to take that leadership. We want peace, that's it. But what else we can do is not clear. And I think there are reasons for that. And there is clearly an expectation gap for why China cannot become the leader from this window of opportunity.
Great. And I mean, on the question of alternate routes, we thankfully on the panel have an expert on the China-Pakistan corridor who has just published a book on this, Dr. Garlick. I mean, does Pakistan present one potential avenue for a sort of non-Russian alternate for trade?
Okay, I'm going to have to be negative again. I want to make clear that, you know, I saw one comment in the questions, which I'm not sure if it's not being sarcastic, I don't know, but I'm not anti-Belt and Road. You know, I started from a position that I was, you know, thought the Belt and Road was a great idea for much needed infrastructure integration across Asia and Europe. It's really much needed, and I was very optimistic about it. But what I'm presenting is the reality on the ground of what's happening. And if you mention Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which was, again, presented with great expectations. It's going to be a game changer, right? This phrase is going to be a game changer. It's gained great currency in Pakistan. But the reality is that that's not a viable alternative route. I mean, you know, I've looked at what's happening on the ground, and there is only the connection between China and Pakistan is the Karakoram Highway, and that was built in the 1970s, completed in the 1970s. They've reconstructed it and they've improved it, but that's the only connection. It's literally one road going across 4,500 meter high mountains, which are closed due to snow for 4 months in the winter. So this idea that Pakistan can be a connectivity corridor from China, you know, through the Belt and Road is just a myth. Basically, it's not happening. The only connectivity they've added is a fiber optic cable which runs from China down through Pakistan, I believe runs to Africa. But in terms of infrastructure connectivity and transport is and given, you know, as we see Pakistan's current instability, political instability with I just saw that in the news today that, you know, for example, unfortunately, very tragically, in Karachi, 3 Chinese employees of the Confucius Institute were blown up in a suicide bombing by Baluchi Liberation Army. So amidst this kind of instability, you know, Pakistan is not an alternative route. No, I would answer absolutely in the negative.
How about the Trans-Caspian route, which was actually if we remember the maps of the BRI, the initial maps, they were not going through Russia, right? That these were the more kind of southern bypassing Russia routes. Does the panel have an opinion on that? And then we don't know what's going to happen to Russia in the future.
Just a quick 2 fingers on my side that, you know, going back, that's something that probably Nargis, you know better about, because I think Kazakhstan immediately after the beginning of Russia's invasion into Ukraine and war in Ukraine tried to reorient some of the, was it oil through the Caspian route? So probably you're asking this question, but you know better than us.
Not only oil, but yes, there's definitely.
So what's the take?
It has its complications. Definitely now we're seeing the push because we do need corridors, and China needs corridors. But it's also not an easy area to go through, right? So you need to, well, go through the Caucasus, and there are some issues there, and so it's not easy. And that's actually the question I have in my mind: how China sees these kind of these connectivity plans in the light of the kind of in the light of the current and potential conflicts, throughout the regions. But anyways, Una, I have a question for you, actually, from Dr. Balmaceda, who is curious about how the very public conflict between China and Lithuania concerning the issue of a Taiwan diplomatic office in Vilnius synergizes with this situation. And she understands that some of the China's responses went above and beyond Lithuania, also affecting other Lithuanian factory suppliers and customers. Could you address?
Yes, certainly. The Lithuanian case was a turn towards a Lithuanian. It was dictated by several domestic developments in Lithuania with a new government, a more value-oriented one, and plus against the backdrop of an anti-authoritarian, that's how it was phrased, kind of a policy. It wasn't just China specific. It was, Russia, Belarus, of course, because it's a country that Lithuania has shares a lot of history with and knows it very well, and also China. And there were some from the public, from the society. There was support towards, for example, the Hong Kong Freedom Way. And that's why when I was speaking before, I said that the Latvian opinion, just a quick side note, the Latvian opinion during COVID had not really worsened of China, right? That's what leads me to believe that the Chinese public diplomacy is better when it's non-existent, and Chinese messaging in a country. Because in Lithuania, the embassy actually tried to challenge these demonstrations, create counter demonstrations, and also came up with some very fiery rhetoric. And of course, Lithuanians do not take these kinds of things lying down. And so the whole debate over withdrawal, or rather just not showing up at 17+1 anymore, stemmed from a combination of these factors. But of course, I think Lithuania, and of course, there was for a second there was a feeling that maybe this will be a start of a wider policy, kind of a two-step policy. First, withdraw from China's multilateral formats in Europe, and second, start looking towards Taiwan and what can be done with Taiwan. But that did not create the traction that Lithuania had expected. Other countries did not follow, although I have to say it did cause an interesting development, because in Lithuania's shadow, other countries started expanding their cooperation with Taiwan without going quite as far and loud as Vilnius. So Vilnius was taking the heat from mainland China, from the People's Republic, and while other countries were also looking what can be done with the island. But your question was how is this issue synergizing with this situation? And I think, of course, the Lithuanians did not expect the secondary dependency. I think the Lithuanians had factored in hybrid threats, had factored in attacks, non-attribution attacks on their internet infrastructure, but they had not planned this because they relied on European partners. But at the end of the day, what happened is that this whole situation turned the needle because Brussels had to take a stand finally, for better or for worse. I don't know, it depends on how you look at it, but Brussels had to, it wasn't ambiguous, to use the word that colleagues have been using today vis-a-vis China. It wasn't ambiguous anymore. But that, of course, and the situation in Ukraine, Lithuania views it, the hardliners, of course, view it as, see, we were right in the first place. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. And Arseny has a raised hand. Arseny, you have intervention.
Thank you, Nargis. About the alternative routes, just a few days ago, China started to test a new transit corridor, multimodal transit corridor, bypassing Belarus and Russia. It connects Xi'an and Mannheim in Germany, and it goes through Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea, then Azerbaijan, Georgia, then Romania, Hungary, etc. So it is one of the indications that China has to adapt to this new security environment, but because the Black Sea is a weak point in this transportation route, I expect that maybe China will need to shift its focus to Turkey as a land bridge between China and Europe in future, especially because Turkey is also interested in getting some investments from China now due to the quite not stable economic situation, as well as Azerbaijan and Turkey are going to reconstruct Nagorno-Karabakh, and China could also play a role in this project. So at least from the logistical point of view, China is actively adapting to this new security environment. So I expect that they will increase their activities by the end of the year, when Xi Jinping solves the major domestic political issues.
So you're saying they kind of, and I think everybody's saying that the kind of the idea of having Eastern Europe as a bridge is not having the best times, right?
I think at this moment, due to the high level of political military risks, it's not the appropriate idea, but in midterm perspective, in the post-conflict environment, I think China could play quite a significant role, especially if China becomes a security provider for Ukraine in the future. At least, as I have said, Kyiv is hosting such consultations now with Chinese counterparts, and the Ukraine's president office is preparing a conversation between two leaders. So they are preparing some conceptual frameworks, but it is also about Belarus in the post-conflict environment, because frankly speaking, I don't see for Russia any chances to win this war by military means. And it leads to my second point, that the defeat of Russia in this war will lead to a new phase of the disintegration of post-Soviet space, meaning that probably Ukraine and Belarus could benefit from this disintegration by reorienting some economic ties from Russia to the European Union. And this is the most beneficial status of Belarus and Ukraine for China, because as I have said, the initial idea was to integrate Belarus deeper in the European market, to invest in the Great Stone Industrial Park, and to sell goods and services, enjoying the tax preferential regime for Chinese companies, but also the lack of trade barriers between Belarus and the European Union. The problem is that the Belarusian leadership didn't manage to comply with these expectations. Ukraine is promised either to get the full EU membership after the conflict, or at least sort of a profound integration form, which will also facilitate more interest from China to use Ukraine as a bridge, economic bridge, to expand its economic interests in Europe. So I would say that in the current environment, it's not the relevant option for China, but as the political military situation starts to stabilize, I think China will definitely use this opportunity to secure its interests, both in Belarus and Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Arseny. James, you had a question?
Yeah, just Arseny and Una both made very interesting points about sort of how China is very quick to adapt. And I'm thinking of Kelly Tsai's recent work here on adaptive authoritarianism, or sort of authoritarianism plus adjective, adaptive, responsive. And one view would be that China is being very sort of good at responding to new developments in Belarus and Lithuania. Another view of that would be to say that China is being very fickle with its partners. It's being very sort of quick to drop partners like Belarus, who have previously proven quite loyal to China. Belarus is often a country that puts forward pro-Chinese views at, say, the United Nations General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Commission. And so for China to sort of turn around and sort of not invite Lukashenko to the Winter Olympics, or to decide to throw its relations with Lithuania away of quite a short period of time, does this show that China is sort of quite ready to drop countries that were otherwise in line with it? And if so, does that sort of send a signal to other countries who might be sort of slightly more concerned about closer ties with China? I guess this is a question for the whole panel, but Arseny, would you like to start us off maybe?
Thank you for this question. According to my opinion, I believe that the main reason why China has withdrawn its attention from Belarus and is reluctant to support the Belarusian leadership is because the Belarusian leadership is not following the initial agreements concluded personally in 2015 with the head of China, Xi Jinping. These agreements were concluded not only rhetorically in words, but then they were fixed in some joint strategic concepts. For instance, including the plan of joint development of the Republic of Belarus and the People's Republic of China until 2020, based on the conjunction of strategic programs of the two countries in medium and long term. And such strategic concepts envisaged quite ambitious agenda, but all they usually focus on how Belarus would facilitate China's trade with Europe. So meaning that Belarus had to find a special model of economic integration with the European Union from which China could benefit. In response, China was ready to enlarge its investments in our country by providing us also with the high tech, establishing joint enterprises, because actually China was ready to shift to another model of economic cooperation, from simple provision of loans to establishing joint companies. But unfortunately, I think the strategic mistake of the Belarusian side was that they simply didn't understand the Chinese strategic intentions. They simply didn't do anything in order to support the Chinese agenda in the Eastern Europe within the Belt and Road Initiative. What is more important, actually, they made a lot of problems for China, spoiling its plans. So I would say that it's quite normal that when your counterpart doesn't meet the terms and conditions of the agreements, then you withdraw from it.
Thank you, Arseny. And well, we need to wrap up soon. Actually, we need to wrap up. Like, let's give ourselves 5 more minutes. But I wanted to ask also the rest of the panel. Arseny took us into the future and made some predictions. I was wondering if other panelists can make 1 or 2 predictions about the future, how they see the situation developing. And we're speaking about China in Eastern Europe, like Eastern Europe, kind of in a broad sense. What's going to happen within the next 5 or 10 years? I understand now it's, we're in the fog of war situation, but what you would expect, or maybe what factors you think are really, really important and they would be shaping China's approach toward the region. So maybe we can go in the other direction. Una, can we go to you and then we go to Jeremy and then to Jinhan?
Sure. Yeah. I actually admire Arseny's approach, where he's really very clear on the implications. But of course, the big question is, when and how is the war going to end? Because that is what we base our projections on, right? After the fog of war clears, after the war ends. But I think also how it ends and what happens and how China is being perceived as a result of this will make or break China's case in the Baltic states. It will not be anything that has security or dual use implications. We will not be seeing Huawei setting up national networks. However, in the most positive scenario, can we even speak of anything positive now? But in a comparatively more positive scenario, some private companies or that do not necessarily deal with these risky. So basically, on the same level as elsewhere throughout the EU, maybe something will also come out of this here. I do not really believe that we're going to see a lot of transit coming through. So I think that ship has sailed. So some kind of a bilateral format might work. And of course, it's going to be industry or business to business driven rather than this political will driven.
Which might be better in the end. Jeremy, can we go to you for some predictions?
Yeah, I know it's very dangerous to make predictions, because they're usually wrong. But I don't have a crystal ball. But I would agree with what Una just said. I pretty much agree with that. I think there needs to be a rethink from the Chinese side about how they approach the region, how they're going to promote better relations. As she said, I think the idea of this land bridge. I mean, to be honest, I think that idea kind of died quite a long time ago, right? Even before this war. I mean, that's just not really happening. I mean, the rail route, the freight on the rail route was always problematic. I mean, there was more freight coming from China, nothing going back, so it wasn't worked out like how that was going to be profitable, how that was going to be better than the maritime route. But anyway, there needs to be just a rethink from the Chinese side. There needs to be some kind of more nuanced approach to Europe and to Central and Eastern Europe, and avoidance of this kind of, I think, I'm in the Czech Republic. Czechs are very sensitive to this idea that they would be lumped into the global South, as we've heard, that Central Eastern Europe is part of the global. I mean, people here just don't see themselves that way. There needs to be a more nuanced approach from the Chinese side. And I think what I'd agree with Una, it needs to focus on business and avoid the politics that's crept into it.
Thank you. Actually, in Central Asia, our hopes were rekindled during the pandemic. The volumes went up actually because of the disruptions with the maritime freight. Jinhan, can we go to you? What's your?
Yeah, I thank you. I agree. I think China should have more nuanced approach towards Eastern Europe. And I think I am less worried. I mean, if I'm Chinese leader, I would be less worried about the long-term run implication of BRI in the region. I mean, in the short term, obviously, the connectivity has been affected, but imagine when the war ends, regardless of what scenario, the region needs China, right? Ukraine needs Chinese investment, Russia needs Chinese investment, they need China came here to do something. And that is not going to be changed 5 years later, 10 years later. That cannot be done by Washington or by EU. So China will be needed if China continue to keep its neutral position on war. So in the short term, I think the BRI is being affected significantly, but in the longer run, I think we do need Chinese investment. But what I'm really worrying about is domestically about Chinese economy and what China can do in the future. I mean, currently China is facing considerable problems domestically in COVID, and COVID has been hit China's economy in many ways. So what I am thinking is, instead of how this war has been affecting China's attention in BRI or in Europe, I'm thinking about how China's domestic economy 5 or 10 years later is being affecting, China's geopolitical goals in the region. Because in the past few years, even before the pandemic, there are a lot of domestic discussion within China are saying whether BRI is a strategic overstretch for China. And after the pandemic, a lot of BRI discussion, Belt and Road discussion in China has been focusing on health, Silk Road, digital Silk Road. And so I'm not sure whether the interest of China on the region will be the same after the war. And much of that depends on whether Chinese economy can continue to grow, whether Chinese economy is doing well. If it's doing well, obviously everything will come back. But if it's not, then China probably have to prioritize its other priorities.
Thank you so much. It's a really excellent point to end our discussion with. Let me thank our wonderful speakers for your very informative and insightful remarks. I want to thank our audiences who joined us here in the webinar and also on YouTube. And I want to thank our co-sponsor, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and of course, Fairbanks Center and the Davis Center, and the Davis Center team, Chris Martin and Laura Sargent, who made this possible, and of course, my partner, James Evans. And please tune in to our future events.